About 30 more seconds. Let's see when it goes live.
Good morning. We'll call this Atzilus Part 2. 2 weeks ago I began with discussing the Tikkun aspect of Atzilus, Tikkun versus Toyu, and last week about Atzilus itself, the root of the word in the Psukim in Baalescha, and the meaning, essentially the ultimate interface, and like Mamutza, Hamachaber, between Elokus, godliness that's higher than Shtalshlus, or let's put higher than structure, higher than the Esespheres, and the Elamis, which are defined by structure. So in Atzilus you have both ends. It's called an Elam Atzilus, and it consists of 10 spheres, from Chachma through Malchus, Meichin and Midas. But at the same time, those spheres are all Kulei Elokus, Iyu v'chayu echad, Iyu v'gamu echad. So you really have a meeting place of where these two come together. So all the language that you find, for example, in Chumash, that Adam is Nivra b'tzelem Elokim, Tzalmenu kidmusenu. And we know the Eibush has no Dmus and no Tzelem. Like it says in Yecheskel, Le Adam hu, Le Mara Adam. So how do we explain Tzelem and Dmus? Or even in these week's Pashas, we talk about V'shechanti b'seicham, V'ne'adati l'chashama, that the Eibush meets and speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu. How do we explain all these? Vayeret Hashem al Har Sinai. You know, where did God come down from? He's everywhere. Malay kol aretz kveidei. Doesn't have to come down anywhere. So all these expressions, Dano, in the Parsha of Zdeim, in Vayera. So you look in Teira and Vayera, he explains in Pasuk Chaliyahu, this is all Atzilus, essentially. That the Eibush is meeting so-called the human race, or the world, in a way that we can relate to it. The Eibush doesn't have to come down in Har Sinai, he can communicate from wherever he is, or from everywhere. But he wants it to be manifest in a way that we can relate to it. And that's really what Atzilus is about. Exactly like in the Psukim, about the Skenim, Vayetzal min haruach, that the Eibush wanted it to be lefiyerach. From Moshe Rabbeinu says, Ma'ayin li basar, he's like above it. The Hashpah still has to come from him. So the Eibush made a slapshus that it would come through the Skenim. But Ruch Shel Moshe, the spirit of Moshe. So Tzelem Elokim means we're created with the Eibush Tzelem, because the Eibush Elokus, not Atzmus, but Elokus was manifest himself in what we call Esespheres. And these Esespheres are essentially one. Say, Hu v'chachmasei echad, Hu v'binasei echad, Hu v'chazdei echad. He's one with them. And therefore we have a place where we can meet. So then, practically speaking, in Aveda, once you have Teira, and Teira, even though Teira is rooted in Shashuim Lefonov, and you can't even call it Zmiris Hayelichul Kecha, is also not even a title for it, because it's completely the mile of everything, and yet Teira is manifest in Chachma. We sit and learn Teira right now, and the mitzvah is to understand Teira, not just Lo Yoda Mai Komar, but to understand it with our Seichel. So how could our Seichel meet God's Seichel? And we say Kol HaKeira V'Sheina, Kosh Baruch Hu Keira V'Sheina Kenegdei, and all the expressions. This is a perfect example. Teira is manifesting in Atzilus. Atzilus has Chachma, Bina, Das, and so on. So we can relate to it. And the meeting place is when we learn Teira, we're learning Chachma Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu, to the point it becomes a Yichud Nifla, like the Alter Rebbe says in Perek Hey, in Tanya. And the same thing with the Midas. So there's the Midas, like you have Ava v'Yirah. How could you have Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem? When the Eibush is completely beyond anything. You could have Ava to someone that's similar to you, to someone you see. You can love your spouse, you can love your children, friends, siblings, parents, children. But how do you have Avas Hashem? So the answer is because there's the Eibush to manifest in the Darga called Ava, called Chesed, and Gvura and Teferes. So indeed, that's what it says in Chassidus. You'll find a number of places, in Ayin Beis several times, but it's mentioned quite a few places, especially by the Rebbe Rashab, that the whole purpose of Atzilus, he says, is using the Lashon of the Zayar, begin dishtamudin bei, in order that we should know him. And then it continues and says, and also we should be able to margish alakus. So if you didn't have Atzilus, essentially, we wouldn't have a place where we can say that we, with our seichel, could know the Eibishter, or can feel and love the Eibishter, or reverence, respect, gvura, yiras Hashem. That's the l'shenis in Maimonic Chassidus. So it all comes to emphasize the necessity of this world. And as I said, it's the perfect balance between the two. You go higher than Atzilus, you already have the beginnings of the Esses Sfiris we know, but they're either imbalanced, as they are in Tayu, or they're Esses Eris and Keli Echad in Akudim, or they're Esses Sfiris Agnuzis, which is B'chlal, just the way the Ebrish is envisioning the structure. But it's not yet B'chlal Kelim, it's before the Tzimtzum, or the root at least of the 10 hidden spheres. But in Atzilus, they call them Esses Sfiris Hagluyas. And the example, which means revealed, and it's manifest, and it's a structure, and something to talk about. There's a real Tselem Elikim, so to speak. Or when we use the word Odom Elyon, what's Odom Elyon? The Eibush is not Siyud Odom. Odom Elyon is usually Atzilus. Now, one more point I want to make with this is, I'm not going over everything I said last week, because I said it last week, but I'm just summing it up to continue and discuss a little more about this process. We also spoke about neshamas of Atzilus and neshamas of Biyah, that all neshamas we say every morning, neshamas shenasata b'tahirihi, that's Atzilus. But then it says, ata barasa, ata yitzarta, ata nefachta bi, ata mishamra b'kirbi. So it's the shtalshlus of the neshama every morning anew, from Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya. So for most neshamas, it was rooted in Tahira, but then it goes through the levushim of Bria, Yitzir. It's like it goes through different filters, so to speak. So by the time it's an Islabish in our Guv Gashmi, it's already through the Dargas of Barasi, Tzata, Nafachta Bi, and all the way, it needs even Shemira, Shema Shamra Bekirbi, in Asiya. And the Neshama of Atzilus also goes, the Rebbe and a Tzaddik also says every morning, Ata Barasa, Ata Yitzata, Ata Nafachta Bi. But Kemuvan, by them, they're going through Biyah, Biyah Yitzir Asiya, is more what the language of Chassidus, B'derech Maiver. Not b'derech hislapshus, which means it passes through. Alter Rebbe says in Kunta Sachen that also has an effect, but it's not the same effect. It doesn't retain it retains the identity of a neshama of Atzilus, but it has the effect. Just like we say Avram Avinu, he was a neshama beguf, so he was a physical body. We saw him physically, but his guf was not mailim and was not concealing and did not in any way distort or change the Atzilus within him. Chesed of Atzilus, which was Avram. So it has to go through Biyah because the Neshama is coming down Lamato. But however, the question is how much Biyah has effect on it. So that's just a little more, just elaborating on that. What I want to cover now is a few more aspects of Atzilus that we didn't discuss yet, as well as, I probably won't do it this week, but then from there I'm going to go. I think the next step will be, we'll go through the Spheres themselves. Since now we're talking about Atzilus and the Spheres are now complete, so I think the next step after Atzilus makes sense to go through Chachma, Bin, go through the 10 Spheres. But that's not for right now. So let's talk about Atzilus itself. So we talked about that Atzilus consists of Eris and Kelim. Eris and Kelim is again perfect Mamutza. Eris Mein HaMoyer, it represents, so to speak, and reflects godliness, Alakus. Kelim, even though it's Alakus, Yuv Garmui Chad, like we discussed, it's a separate Chad, but it's Alakus. But it's Alakus that is focused on the Keli, not on the Oyer, not on the, like we said, not on the Rotzna Elyon or the Alakus Shebezeh, but on what the Alakus wants. He wants Chesed, he wants Gvura. So if you only have the focus that it's Chassidus Shel Kodesh Baruch Hu, then it's not fulfilling its function. A Chesed of Atzilus, if you interviewed it, has to speak about Chesed, not about Gvura. So therefore, it has to have structure. And Kelim is what creates structure. So the Oyer remains somewhat more Pashut, more beyond structure, it defies structure, no matter what opinion, which I'll talk about in a moment. But bottom line is, Oyer compared to Keli is always more Pshitus. Just like a flame and a wick. That if you don't have a wick, the flame would disappear. So the wick grounds it, but the flame remains essentially, really defies gravity, and even defies a keli, but it's enough to connect with a wick, like when we talk about a psila and a esh. So derech is also with a keli and a eir. The Eir has definitely gone through a process to make it ready to enter into Keli, but at the same time, it's still called Eir. It's not called Keli. And so Keli is the focus on the actual structure. What does Chesed mean? How is it different than Gvura? The Eir is more on the Elokus Sheba Chesed, that this is God's Chesed, Hashem Hagdula, Hagvura, the Hashem Shebezeh. So it's in a way, it's a dakazdik, it's a subtle difference, but the focus is on the structure, because you need structure, because you need a dira b'tachtenim ultimately. But on the other hand, you want it still to be a divine structure. So therefore, the Eris and Kalim are both there. They both serve different purposes, but they join together. And there you have set the stage that now, once after the Atzilus will come, the Parsa and Bria, and then more Yeridus, and more Halamas Vestadium, and more Ishtalshlus, which we'll talk about as we go through these worlds. But you have them all evolving and rooted in Atzilus. I should just mention, since we talked about it, but just for the record, we talked earlier when I spoke about Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, we spoke about Atzilus the Klolos, and there's Atzilus the Protis. So generally speaking, wherever Chassidus says Atzilus, it means Atzilus the Protis, unless the Maimon says explicitly otherwise. Which means everything in the Shtalshlus is microcosm, macrocosms, like Iskalus. So just like there's Chochmah, there's Bina and Chochmah, and there's Chochmah and Bina. So the truth is there's Atzilus even in the highest level. So, but generally speaking, Atzilus the Klolos we discussed is Erein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum, but the lowest levels, meaning like the Esses Sfiras Hagnuzis. So why confuse matters? Why call it Atzilus even? If Atzilus is an Elam that is only created after the Tzimtzum, yes, albeit a Elam of Elokus, why we call it this way? Because ultimately the purpose of Atzilus and Bria Tzidasi is to connect to Lifnei Tzimtzum and to connect to higher worlds. The thing is, the way you connect is first you have to do it on the lower level. So Atzilus the Protis is what we're discussing now, is after Ak and Akudim comes Atzilus the Protis. And then comes Bria Tzidasi the Protis. But B'chlolos, Atzilus the Klolos, if you recall, as the Tzemach Tzedek, the Alter Rebbe Tzemach Tzedek, and the Maimer Drush Gimel Minei Adam say Atzilus the Klolos is generally the Esses Sfiras Hagnuzis, or which concludes with Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. Bria the Klolos is Ak, Adam Kadman. Yitzira the Klolos is either Akudim and Akudim, or Kes Atik and Arich. And Asiya the Klolos is Atzilus the Protis, and Bria Yitzira Asiya the Protis. That's since we're talking about Atzilus, I wanted to point it out. So, in essence, many times, especially the Rebbe Rashab will say that just as it is in Atzilus the Protis, you could from that learn how it is in Atzilus the Klolos. It's a completely different level, but there's a similarity, because when you compare, let's say, Erein Sof before the Tzimtzum, after the Eibishter already envisions, after Ola B'Ritzeinei, and there's already Shir Atzmei B'Keach, the Eibishter's envisioning existence, compared to Ak, is similar to Atzilus the Protis compared to Bria the Protis. So, though it's not in the same level, same plane, but it's the same idea, the same concept. However, it's more in this is more macrocosm, meaning on a much higher level, and this is more microcosm. Now, another thing to keep in mind, which also helps understand these things, is the klal that the Alter Rebbe established right in the beginning in Tanya, in Perek Gimel, where he says that the Esser Kreiches HaNefesh are Nishtalshlu Mehen from the Esser Sfiras. Now, just as for the record, I'm not sure if that's said anywhere else, that exact Lashon. It's implied for sure, because the whole Chassidus and Kabbalah is based on that the Adam HaTachten is created B'Tselem Elokim. But that exact language tells us this, that if you want to understand the Esser Sfiras in Atzilus, you have to understand the Esser Kreiches, and vice versa, because one is nishtalshul from the other. So really, if you want to have b'psari echzel lekah, examples of so-called Atzilus and Bria Tzir Asiyah through the Esser Sfiras, we look at our keiches. So what would be the dugma for it? So you find in Chassidus, we talk about that keiches ha-nefesh, you have keiches ha-gluyim, you have keiches ha-nolamim, you have keiches hiyulim, you have keiches atzmim, you have keiches ha-klulim b'nefesh, and you have etzem, and you have nefesh neser keiches. So I spelled out now 6 levels? These 6 levels are actual levels within our nefesh. In other words, the nefesh itself, if you're able to so-called see it or dissect it, you're not going to see any keiches in it. because obviously it's all ruchniistic, but it's more than that. The keiches are completely not yet shaped and formed. So even our very nefesh, we have a state of pshittus. Though we can't experience it directly, but it's your nefesh before it goes down levels. It's like in a state that's even higher than Atzilus, higher than Michlal Eser Keiches. The highest level of nefesh neser keiches, sometimes called Yechelis HaNefesh, or like compared to Yechelis HaAtzmos. In other words, the nefesh has the capacity to have chachma and bina, but it's not yet shaped that way. You go all the way to the other extreme, which we can relate to, the keiches gluyim. So that's clearly keiches that we see, whether it's the keich ha'asiyah, keich ha'ksiva, the power to write, or the power to speak, or the power to see or to hear. Seichel, midas. So the gluyim is what we experience. Nelomim is already a step beneath that. Like for example, if I'm speaking now a few words, I can speak many more words, but I'm not necessarily doing that. So just because the keich goli seems a certain way, or you can throw, let's say, a rock throw a stone for 50 feet. And someone says, that as far as you can throw it? No, I didn't exert myself. You didn't use all your keiches. Where's the rest of the keich? It's nelam. But it's there. You can access it any time. Yes, with exercise and conditioning, you may be able to train your muscles, and you can also end up throwing something even further. Just like some people can run a mile, and if they work on it, they condition themselves, they can end up running a marathon for 20 miles. Basically, in the language of Chassidus, that would be megala, the keiches nelam into keiches gluyim. Now, the truth is, you can say nelam is not without any exercise. It's just nelam, you're just not using it to the fullest. Nelam, you can say, but however, when you go to keiches hiyulim, and I'm not going to go through all the levels right now, I'm just giving it as an example, or keiches atzmim, then you could say that's like the keich atzmi, the etzem hakeich and the nefesh. That could be something that we don't access so easily. Maybe that you need yigiyah and exertion, like he says in Samach Vav, the difference between the two types of helamas. He says a helam she'ena b'mitzias, a helam she'yeshna b'mitzias. The example being the difference between a hot coal and a flintstone, a tzura chalamish. So a hot coal, a white hot coal, if you look at it, you may think it burned out. But you sure don't want to touch it, because it could be even hotter than a coal that's revealed. Now, if you fan it, or you put it in water, you right away see that there is fire there. It's just not seen. You don't see the fire. So that's like a keiches nalomim. What's a tzura chalamish? A flintstone. You can touch it, you can put it in water, and yet it still has the power to give off a spark. But to do that, you need a strong yigi. You need to strike it. You need a real hakah in order to bring out the spark. So he says that's al derech halelam she'ena b'mitzias, more like a keich atzmi. So it's there, but you can't access it easily. You can't just blow on it or fan it and suddenly it'll start, you have to strike it. Just to give an example. So essentially, going back to Atzilus, B'ri, Yetzir, Asiyah, if you think of them, of the Svidus in each one of them, it all comes down to how begoli it is. So generally speaking, Svidus of Atzilus is like keiches gluyim, but it's in a pure way. It's like the healthiest type of person where all the keiches are perfect. Once you're going beyond, higher than Atzilus, you're already going to Nalomim and Hiyulim and Atzmim and all the way up to the highest levels. It's just a way to look at it. So you'll say, what's B'riya Tzir Asiyah in this context? Well, B'riya, when we'll talk about it, is essentially the same Esesviras, but they're now not in a perfect way. I can just give an example. When a child is born, Baruch Hashem, a healthy child, when a child is born, everything worked perfectly. For example, you look at a newborn child, you'll see the lungs, you could actually see the child breathing, because the child is using 100% of its lungs. By the time we're already 5-6 years old, we're not losing all the entire lungs, because the toxins that we breathe in and the pollutants make you not be able to breathe with all the lungs. When you get older, less and less. That doesn't mean you can't breathe, it just means chas v'shalom, but it means you're not using full. That's why many people, if they take a full breath in, start coughing. Because you're usually not breathing with all of your lungs, you're using 90% of them. What's the point? That the keiches, in their purest form, if you're using them 100%, that's like a world of Atzilus. It's all pure. The Eidos and Kalim are seamless. There's so-called, in the example that I'm using, there's no aging, there's no disease. So the Eris and the Kalim work perfectly together. An adult, as we get older, different things start blocking, whether it's the pollutants, arteries get blocked, other things as a person ages. The Eris and Kalim are not not aligned with each other. The Rebbe Rashab, in Shkafta the Rebbe, Perl Rifkin writes that the last days of his life, which is he's documenting there, the last days of the Rebbe Rashab's life in Chayim Chayuseh B'Al Medain. So the last night, I think, or the night before that, he says that they heard the Rebbe Rashab saying something, and then he began coughing, and then he said, the Eris zayin sich nicht miyashav in the Kalim. That was the Rebbe Rashab's expression. That the Eris zayin sich nicht miyashav in the Kalim. That means the Eris can't settle into the Kalim, which essentially means, ultimately, if the Eir and Keli cannot work with each other, that's called what we call misa, death. Illness is that the Eir and Keli are struggling with each other. And the truth is, it makes total sense when you think about it. Any, God forbid, illness is essentially the Eir and Keli are cannot able to fully function well with each other. Question is to what extent? So when you talk about B'ri Yitzir Asiyah, the Eir and Keli are no longer as aligned as they are in Atzilus. In Atzilus, it's a perfect alignment. The Keli and the Eir work mamish perfectly, without any obstructions and without any distortions. They're aligned. The Keli is a perfect Keli for the Eir is perfectly fit for the Keli. Like Mashpia and Makabel, they work together perfectly. Any imbalance is already a result of halamis that come afterwards, and will the Bria, and then even more in Yetzirah, and all the way into Asiyah, until Asiyah Gashmis, into Tachne Shein Tachne Lamatim. So, that's an additional point in understanding Atzilus. Now, there's so much in Chassidus about Atzilus, I don't think I can cover it all. I'm just trying to cover some main key things, especially in the context of, say, the Shtalshlus, and most importantly, our Avodah. As I discussed last week, you could ask the question, why do you need to know about this Atzilus? If none of us could ever reach that level, and the Alter Rebbe would tremble, even when he said the word Atzilus, he couldn't even say the word. Because you know what it is, it's like pure lakus. Yes, it's a lakus in svidus and in a structure, but it's a lakus. So why are we told about it? So as I explained, it's because we are always told about what the standard is. It's like, why do we learn in the Tanya, the Alter Rebbe has to tell us in Perek Yud what a tzaddik is? If we can only be a beini, why do we need to know? The Alter Rebbe wrote a Sefer Shel Tzaddikim. Why do he tell us Perek Yud a tzaddik? Because at the end of the day, the Rebbe explains in different places, even a tzaddik is also something that was negated to us. First of all, it's important to know what the standard is. What is the real perfect avodah, where a person completely has no yetzer hara, or whether tzaddik gomer or tzaddik sheina gomer. And even if we never reach it, but it's like you always want to know what the destination is. Like you want to know what is a perfect human being. So you have something to strive for, as far as you can go. Secondly, we all have bedakos. In some way, we have a tzaddik within us, we have a beini within us, we have a rasha within us. I think Vayetze, Tov Shinun, the Rebbe said that explicitly. Sefer HaSichos Tov Shinun, that everyone has tzaddik beini rasha within them, which explains then, of course, why the Alter Rebbe explains it all. Now, what does that mean? It means you can be b'chlolis in the gather of a rasha v'tevle, but that doesn't mean you don't have neshama shenesata b'tahiri. We say that every morning. If we didn't have that, why do we say neshama shenesata b'tahiri? If after it goes through rasha yitzata nefachta bi, you could say it's no longer tahira, because it always remains tahira. Like when we say afal pishachati yisrael, the neshama is always intact. We're not accessing it, or we have to work on accessing it. By a tzaddik or a neshama Atzilus has that without all these filters. So it's always critical to know that, so to speak, Atzilus exists right within us, which really explains why you see the Rebbe demanding from people, Anoshim Kerkenu, the highest things. Because the Rebbe looks at a person, looks at you, looks at us, as what we can be, not just what we think we are. What we think we are is like the Koiches Gluyim. You see somebody, you see, okay, you don't see their potential, you don't see the ability to be far better than we are. Now, obviously, it's also, we're not fooling ourselves. It's not like we don't know that we're not perfect people. But it's important to know, as I mentioned from the Alter Rebbe, how great we can become. If you don't have that, basically what the Torah is teaching you and expecting from you something greatness. Not just mediocrity and not just but to reach the greatest levels. Yes, but Peil Mamish, Midas Beinei is Midas Kolodim, V'acharel Kolodim Yimsha, because that's something which we can actually physically do, because everyone has the power to control the Machshava Dibur Maisa. But never think that in Neshama, we learn Perek Beis, Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish. Then the Alter Rebbe says, that Chelik Elikam Mamish goes through Ishtalshlus. And that's why there's a difference between Neshama's Geveyas, or Neshamas, like he says, from Akvaim, or B'chinas Tzipernayim. But they're all, that's not negating what he said in the beginning of the Perek Beis. That's a Chelik Elikam Emal Mamish. However, like I said, it goes through these Levushim. So essentially, everything that says anywhere about Atzilus is relevant to each one of us. However, everything L'fiyerach, just like we say every day, V'haftas Hashem Elikecha, B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, B'chol Meidecha. Everybody has the Levavcha, Navavshecha, and Meidecha. But one Meidecha, Moed Shalcha, is different than my Moed. So everybody has the capacity to go beyond themselves. What is beyond is all L'fiyerach who you are. So really in Inyan, you could say Atzilus is not some stationary planet in the sky. It's a level, it's a dimension. And everybody of us can be Atzilusdik if you wish. You know, I mentioned, I think also, the Rebbe saying once, Pischuli kechudesh lamachat. That moment, you know, if a person has a Chassidus by Ne'ilah, Yom Kippur, that moment you can be a Tzaddik Gomer. That doesn't suddenly change you that you became a Tzaddik Gomer full time. But it means for a moment a person was in a state of Mesiras Nefesh, or feeling that, and they feel completely devoted. The challenge is to maintain it and to bring it into the regular routine of day-to-day Aveda B'chol Yom V'Yom. But the capacity that a person has, which of course is a very different way of looking at a Yid and a human being, which unless you learn Chassidus, you don't see it that way. So that's why it's hard to criticize someone that didn't learn Chassidus, and they see, let's say, what they call Pesha Yisrael, someone that is not living up to the standards. They see them as inferior. They see them, look, this person is off limits. When the Rebbe started Miftzat Film, that put on film on every man or after Bar Mitzvah, so there was the tainus. What do you mean? A gufnaki and all the different conditions. But remember, the whole basis was that it began with the idea that neshama is pure. Yes, enochanami, tinik shanishba, and there may be different things, but if you don't have that element, like the Rebbe quotes in Hilchas Gedushin, Sef Perek Beis from the Rambam, about Keifanesi Ache Emeretzani, that the Cheretz then get mu'usa. It's forced. A get can't be forced. How can it be Keifanesi? So the Rambam answers, Mamash Chassidus Rambam, that what? That no, it's the opposite. Yitzrehu sha'anseh. He's forced by his Yetzer Hara, but every Yid wants to do what the Eibishter wants, and one does not want to do what the Eibishter doesn't want him to do. And you say, what do you mean? But Poel Mamish, you see people all the time are doing what the Eibishter doesn't want. But that's not the etzem of the person. That's Yitzrei. That's the force that's outside of him. And the Rebbe quotes this, Chassidus quotes this Rambam. It's essentially this idea that he has, in language of Chassidus, he has Atzilus and Tehera with him all the time. Whether he acts on it is another story. So there are situations where Bezdin can be kaveya that you force him because you're not forcing him. You're only forcing, if someone's holding him hostage, so you're releasing him from being kidnapped by the Yetzer Hara and freeing and allowing him to be the true who he's supposed to be. There's much more to talk about this, what that means exactly, and when, and can you apply that in every situation? Because based on that, the big question is then it's just a Maimon Amuzga. So then what's the concept of a get Musa? Nothing should be ever forced. Everyone wants to do what the Torah says. So that's not for now. That I'll leave Rabbi Shachat and the others that deal with Hilchas Gittin and Kedusha. But to go back to our topic here, so Atzilus is essentially the level that gives us the perfect picture of what the world would look like. Think of it, Lasid Lave, what the world will look like if it's completely aligned with Elokus. I think I mentioned this once. I just to drive the point home practically. There's a Sikha in Chelik Chav Hei Vayigash, where the Rebbe added a whole sif b'ksav Yad Kodshe when he was Magiya that Sikha, and it's very practical, but it's also very profound, and I think it's worthwhile mentioning here. There, the Sikha is concerned with the issue that there's talking about Vayigash Yehuda Elov, you're talking about the Hagosha of Yehuda and Yosef. And Aveda and Ruchnius, Yehuda is Maisa, and Yosef is Talmud. That's why their name Yehuda Heidah, and Yosef is Esofa. And the Machlekes in the Gemara, Talmud Gadol or Maisa Gadol. And that was essentially the confrontation between Yosef and Yehuda, both throughout their whole history. Later it would manifest in the split of the Malchus Yisrael and Malchus Yehuda. Also Yosef and Yehuda were the leaders of both. As the Haftarah says in Vayigash, that La'osad Lovei will become V'hoya Eitz Echad, from both, and it will be Nasi David Avdi Le'elam, that Yehuda will be the Melech. But in the stages before that, you need Yosef to prepare us to reach the level of Yehuda. The language of Chassidus, that you first need Limud Torah to know, like Talmud Gadol, Shemevi L'dei Maisa. That's why Yosef ended up being a leader. Even though Malchus is given to Shevet Yehuda. But the Yehuda is Malchus, Sfiras HaMalchus. Yosef is Yisod, the Mashpia. And you first need to have the Giluyim to then be Megala, the Etzem of Yehuda, which will be L'Osad Lovei. So this is expressed in the Talmud Gadol and Maisa Gadol. So the Gemara concludes Talmud Gadol Shemev L'dei Maisa, because it has both. L'chal Masayimon. You have Talmud and Maisa. But then it says in Sfarim that the L'Osad Lovei will be Maisa Gadol. So the Klotz Kasha is, what does that mean? Talmud has both. So why suddenly is Maisa Gadol going to be like Maisa without Talmud? And you already resolved this. And the Rebbe, there's an answer in the Sikha, and the Rebbe added his own, the Ksav Yad, he added this answer, the following answer. The Rebbe says like this: why do you need Talmud? Why do we B'chal need to learn? Why can't we just do what the Eibishter wants? The answer is because in Elam Hazeh, we don't feel what the Eibishter wants. So if you don't look in Shulchan Aruch, and you don't look in Torah, you won't know what's right and what's wrong. When it comes to your body, you don't need to look in a sefer to know when you're hungry. You wake up in the morning, you're hungry, your body tells you you're hungry, or when it's tired, or other physical things. But the neshama doesn't speak quite that way, or we don't hear the voice of the neshama. Neshama doesn't tell you right away, I'm hungry or thirsty and I need a mitzvah or a Torah. So therefore, the only way to know that today is going to be, that Shabbos is coming, because the calendar at Shabbos, the Torah tells us what to do on Shabbos. However, L'Osad Lovei, once the world will be V'nigla K'ved Hashem, but all called Basar Yachdov, meaning the physical world will feel Elokus. As the Medrash says, that a person will go Shabbos or Shemitah and tear off a te'ena, a fig from a tree, the te'ena will yell out, Shabbos today, or Shemitah, depending on the girsa there. So you have to look in a Shulchan Aruch, because the world itself will tell you. Even Mikir Tizak, the stones themselves will cry out from the walls. Because Elokus will be, just like today the body tells you it's hungry, you'll feel what the Eibishter wants you to do, L'Osad Lovei. So then you don't need Talmud. Talmud is only there to teach you. So that's why Maisa Gadol, that's how the Rebbe answers. He brings the halacha the Rebbe brings many times about behemish and ishtata, that a shemer, let's say, agrees to protect an animal. His friend says, I'm going on a trip and I need you to watch my animal. And then, so of course if he agrees, he's responsible. If the animal destroys something or tramples on somebody's property, the shemer is responsible because he took upon himself. But the question is, what happens if the animal jumps into fire and gets hurt or killed? Is the shemer responsible? And the answer is no. It's a Neisei Kelim of the Shulchan Aruch, he brings there for Chesha Mishpat. Why is no? Because how is the shemer supposed to know that's a crazy animal? A normal animal would never jump into fire, as we see. So unless the owner warned him, how is he supposed to watch out for something that's not expected? For regular damage that an animal tramples or walks in the wrong property or steps on a keli or whatever, that he's responsible for. So even an animal senses that fire is dangerous and therefore won't jump into fire. So the Rebbe uses that as an example, that when the whole idea that we can do an Aveda which is like putting your hand in fire, is because we don't feel it's fire, or we don't feel the damage, we don't feel the effects of fire. That's why Ein Adam Ever Aveda Elim Ken Nichnas Bei Ruach Shtus. The Ruach Shtus, why Ruach Shtus? Every one of us can say, 1 second, I have a nice Yetzer Hara, I don't need a Ruach Shtus, I just have a taiva, or a temptation. Because there's no way that without Shtus that a person would do something that's destructive. So you have to say you don't see it. It's a moment of insanity, or a moment of blindness. I don't know if that's a defense in the Bezdin Shalmaila, but the bottom line is, it can't be that a person would know the damage done, that they would do something destructive to them. But that's been Ne'elam Hazeh, today. But L'Asad Lavei, that will not be the case, because then we will know the world itself, the whole world will be saturated, and therefore Talmud will not be needed. So the Rebbe concludes, and why then, so why we're going to learn Teda L'Asad Lavei, we know. So the Rebbe cites from the Geras HaKedesh, Simach Chavov, then Teda will be not to know Isser and Heter, but it'll be Liyachid Yechudim El Yenim. Because remember, Teda is still Chachmos Kodesh Baruch. You can learn Teda not necessarily to know the halacha. You learn Teda to understand the Eibishter and connect with highest levels. That's the word. Why am I bringing it? Because to me, it's an excellent way to explain what does a world look like when Atzilus is Begili. When you say L'Asad Lavei, that will be like the world, the Elam Hazeh will be like Atzilus, completely aligned. This is a perfect way to explain it. Now the Rebbe says in Bas Lagani Tavshin Aleph, brings about Atzilus, he says, so when we do a mitzvah today, a mitzvah officially changes the world, right? We said Matan Torah, mitzvah gives us the power to change Gashmias from a chefze shel chel to a chefze shel kedusha. So where do we see that? Do you see when you do a mitzvah, when you take a Sefer Torah, can you see physically the Sefer Torah has become more refined? Yes, we respect it, and there's a certain awareness, but you don't feel or see it. You see when you do a mitzvah with an esrig or tzitzis or anything, you see a shinui in the chefze. So Chassidus answers, the Rebbe brings there from the Rebbe Marash, that it's like munach b'kufsa. It's like, yes, it generated energy, but since we're not on the energy level, einei basar, our physical eyes can't see, so it's like munach b'kufsa, it's like stored in a treasure chest. And L'Asad Lavei, the chest will open, and it'll just be Gilei Hell, and it's there already. So the world has changed. And in many ways, you could see changes. The Rebbe speaks in the early Nuns and the late Mems about the shinuyim in the Welt that you see, whether technology or political freedoms or the fall of the Soviet Union, and other things that the Rebbe said clearly is signs that the world has changed. But the real full change will only be L'Asad Lavei. I'm just trying to make it practical that Atzilus is not just some abstract idea, it's actually the world the way it's meant to be. Our Aveda is to now align what we have right now. So if someone says to you, what does your chesed look like? Chesed in Elam Asiyah Agashmi. So you could describe, here's how my chesed works. I'm kind when I want to be, sometimes I'm not so kind. Can you align your chesed with the chesed of Atzilus? That would be essentially the formula of what Aveda would look like. Now obviously you can't jump. So try to align it first to Asiyah Ruchnius, a chesed of Asiyah Ruchnius, a chesed of Asiyah, Bria, Yitzira Ruchnius, and then Bria, and then Atzilus. If you look in Perek Vav in Tanya, there's Hagah, where he talks about how the Esser Spheres of Atzilus are mislabish in the Esser Spheres of Bria, and then into Yitzira, and then Asiyah. It's a very powerful Hagah. In other words, we have Atzilus right here, however, it's through the garments of Bria, Yitzira, and Asiyah. It's our Aveda that requires. So the more we understand Atzilus, the more we understand where we're working toward. Like I mentioned with the lungs last week, that when you see healthy lungs, you can understand, okay, these are lungs that are not so healthy. So now we know what to work toward. So Atzilus is essentially our benchmark of the standard of what we work toward. When you understand Chesed of Atzilus in the fullest sense, you then can say, okay, now I can look at the Chesed in my life and see how close is it. That's why we have the Maimar Chazal, Yehirotz, and it says that a person will be asked, Mosai Yagia, Maisil, Maisi de Avesai. How could you expect that our Maisim will be like the Maisim of Avesai, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov? But Maisa of a similar bonim, we also have Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov right inside us. We're told Avram within you is Chesed within you, Yitzchak within you is Gvura, Yaakov is Tiferes. It's all within us. However, yes, it's the purest form of it. So that's why we can be expected. What does your chesed look like? I can tell you, I've done many workshops and many conferences and many seminars on this topic with completely secular people who never even heard of the word Atzilus or B'ri Yitzir Asiyah. And what I did was it was like a relationship workshop. And I said, okay, how does a person love? You love your spouse. Okay, that's called chesed. Now, what does that look like? And I actually laid out what chesed of Asiyah looks like and what chesed of Yitzira and Bria and Atzilus, to give people a standard. And I can tell you, it had a visible impact, because unless you know what's expected, people don't know what I'm capable of. Some people think, we all do it the same way. I have no real hope for me. But you want people to grow, you have to give them these levels. So I'm really, really explaining also more than just Atzilus here. Also, say the Ishtalshalus. You're talking about how you grow from a Asiyah level to a Yitzira level to a Bria level, and ultimately to Atzilus level. Now, can we all reach that immediately in the fullest sense? As I said, no, that's not what we're talking about. But you can definitely improve it. And when someone says, okay, I think I love my wife in the best possible way. I think I love my children in the best possible way. Very nice. Then you suddenly hear the standard of what chesed really is like in Atzilus. You say, oh, 1 second, I'm not there yet. I remember when I was writing Toward a Meaningful Life, so I had an editor that I hired to help me. So he was a secular Jew. Actually, he was born, interestingly, he was the youngest of 8 children born to 2 Jewish parents who converted to Catholicism. Yeah, it's like a Baal Shem Tov Maisa here. And he didn't even, he would go to church every day. So he was a journalist, and we had found him, and he was working with me. His name is Stephen Dubner. He later became the famous author of the book called Freakonomics, in case you want some name dropping. Al Capone, that's not my point. My point is that he never learned Torah, he never learned Chassidus. And this was like his first, and that was my kavanah. I wanted someone who's not going to bring his ideas into it. I wanted someone who just knows how to polish the prose, the language. So it was really a great partnership, worked very well together. I mean, I wrote it all, but I was able to write 90 pages, and he could take out the redundancies and turn it into 10 pages. It was really, that was his role. Now, at the time, I remember once, we would talk many times, of course. So one night he calls me up, it's like late at night, 11 o'clock, and he says to me, you're destroying my life. So I said, how am I destroying your life? I thought, I'm enriching your life. He says, I have a girlfriend, and I don't think she was Jewish, if I recall correctly. And he says, I'm now working on the chapter on love and marriage and intimacy, and I'm reading what the standards are, and I look at her and I say, hey, this isn't anything close, my relationship with her. And just really creating a lot of tension here. Well, what do we know? And a few weeks later, they broke apart. Now, I didn't tell him whether I was happy or not happy. It wasn't my business to tell him what to do. He was just reading about a higher standard that he had not known. Anyway, the story's not over. A few years later, he got married to a very fine woman in Manhattan. He has 2 children now, named the one after his father. His father was a Borough Park Jew, a frum Jew, for whatever reason, in the 50s, converted to Catholicism. It's a story of its own. He wrote a book about this too, called Turbulent Souls. I think he changed the name later. It's a story about his life, very bizarre life. But Al Capone, he invited me to the wedding. It was in Manhattan. And he invited me to say a few words. So I told this story. I said that, I remember Stephen calling me at 11 o'clock at night and telling me that I'm destroying his life and his relationships. So I have to say that since he's married now, Ellen was the name, that means that Ellen does live up to the standards, because he knows what the standards are now. So this marriage is a reflection of, I didn't say the world of Atzilus, because I don't know if that was the exact standard, but I saw with my own eyes that when you teach someone something of a standard they're not even aware of, it changes your whole being. And I think it's a critical thing to understand, when people ask, why do we need a Rebbe? Why do we need a tzaddik? It's the same question. Why do you need Atzilus? Kairach asked that question. Everyone's holy. Because firstly, you need a standard. You need to see, no, this is a neshama of Atzilus. This is what Atzilus expects. So you don't have a distortion and that's a chayin, convince yourself, I'm already there. You're not there. So understanding that's why people, the first time they hear about the Rebbe, and the way Chassidim, Chabad Chassidim look at the Rebbe, they never saw anything like that. And it can be even disturbing. They say, my Rosh Yeshiva, I never look at him that way. He's infallible, and all the other things. Now, maybe some of them have learned and they've started worshiping their personalities. And I don't know, the worshiping is not the right word, but you know what I mean. So when you really come to understand, you can't understand a Rebbe unless you understand Atzilus, and unless you understand Chassidus. It's not because it's not a cult figure. That's most people think such devotion to a man, so it's a cult. They have a guru, lahavdil. But it's only when you understand what is a neshama of Atzilus. And the Eibishter set neshamas of Atzilus to this world, like he explains in Perek Beis and Tanya. And the dofka boy. What's the idea when it says in Mechilta that Vayiminu b'Hashem b'Moshe Avdi? It equates in saying, Misha le'maymin, if you don't believe in Moshe, it's like not believing in the Eibishter. How could you say such a thing? You show it to people, they don't believe, they think it's a Chassidus Shavart. It's a medrash b'feidish and medrash. How do you explain such a medrash? How could you equate a person, even the greatest, to the Eibishter? The only way is understanding Atzilus, that the Eibishter himself imparted, so to speak, Elokus into a manifest state, and those neshamas that flow from there, Ovis Heinen Merkava. And same thing with all neshamas of Atzilus, are a Merkava 24/7. Once you understand the concept, then you say, okay, then I can understand. It really gives a whole different take on the idea why we look at, like, many people ask the question, Rabbi Akiva, he was a great scholar, but why? Who says we can't disagree with him? Why not? He's a human being. But the whole idea of Chasimus Hashas, why can't we disagree? It's all Alpi Teira, Alpi Seichel. And when you come to understand, no, there are neshamas that the Eibishter gave. Kemuvin, they also Bari Seichel and Talmidei Chachamim, but they also have an element of bittul, and their bittul allows them to be in a way that they are reflective of the emes of the Eibishter. And that's critical, because if you take away that, if you only have the Eibishter and Teira, and you don't have Talmidei Chacham that are conveying Teira in a fully honest way, it destroys the whole integrity of Teira. Because someone will ask a question, 1 second, that's very nice. The Eibishter gave Teira 3,333 years ago, or 34 years ago, and fine, but how do you know, how did it get to us? It came through people. How do you know that people didn't change things? Even if not b'kavanah. A human being, you play telephone, for example, and I say the word apple, and you go through the room, and everybody whispers, and there it is. It'll come back at the end, it'll be elephant, or whatever. This is in the same room, people living in the same time. That's how it works. When you say words, things go through changes. And here we're talking about thousands of years, and Eden went through all kinds of nisyanis and challenges. How do we know that Teira is exactly Teira Semes, the way it was given by Matan Teira? Because you have to say that Eibishter chose people and made sure that they have the rules, if they follow the rules of how they teach Teira and how they develop Teira, that it will not be distorted. It will not be in any way, no ziyuf, not b'kavana, not b'kavana. And you can only understand that, essentially, Atzilus allows us to understand because it becomes a mamutza, essentially between Elokus and existence. So that's just some ways to explain Atzilus in a more, I guess, balbatisha or practical way. Okay, well that will stop here. Everyone have a good day.